It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. The dire warning from a 4-star general that every U.S. citizen must heed now. Did you know you could be the next casualty of war, according to one U.S. military commander? Yes, you, an ordinary citizen. In fact, all 320 million Americans are vulnerable, here on U.S. soil, with no warning, and at any time. It doesn't matter if you live in a big city, a small town, or even out in the sticks. I'm talking about a catastrophic event that could potentially affect every living soul in the continental United States. And it's something that most people have never even heard of. You see, there's a sinister weapon available to both hostile nations and independent actors alike. And if it were used against the U.S., the results would be nothing short of devastating. According to one of the best military minds in the U.S. Armed Forces, it's only a matter of time until someone attacks the entire U.S. power grid, and it would bring us to our knees. That prediction was made by U.S. CENTCOM Commander General Lloyd Austin. It's not a question of if, he said. It's a question of when. Let that sink in for a moment. Now, would it shock you to know that the U.S. government has been aware of this weapon for decades? Would it shock you even more to know that they could protect you from it just by requiring an investment of a couple $2 billion of upgrades? Compare that to the almost $2 trillion already spent on the war on terror. Would it shock you to know that they've ignored the advice of the best experts, specially commissioned reports, and congressional testimony? And that they've utterly failed to take the simple legislative actions that would protect our nation? Even the former Secretary of Homeland Security, Michael Chertoff, has a flippant attitude about it. He thinks if you have the foresight to buy a battery-powered radio, everything will be just peachy keen. But if this weapon were deployed, in a fraction of a second, our life as we know it would be over. Our entire society would be maimed, crippled, and die a slow, agonizing death. And the reason is quite surprising. It's called electromagnetic pulse, or EMP for short. EMP is what happens when a nuclear device is detonated very high in the atmosphere. The blast and the radiation won't hurt you, but it's still deadly. Here's why. An electromagnetic pulse has the potential to fry almost every electrical and electronic device made. And the biggest target of all? The entire U.S. power grid. In fact, it acts as a giant antenna and actually attracts the electromagnetic pulse that could destroy it, and every electronic gadget in your home. The U.S. government well knows the impact such an EMP attack would have on our nation, and it isn't pretty. 2 special congressional commissions have been tasked with investigating and reporting on the EMP threat. The Heritage Foundation, a Washington, D.C. think tank, was also tasked with investigating the results of an EMP attack. What they found is grim. Airplanes would literally fall from the sky, cars and trucks would stop working, and water, sewer, and electrical networks would fail, reported the Heritage Foundation. Food would rot, medical services would collapse, and transportation would become almost non-existent. The Congressional EMP report stated, within 12 months of an EMP attack, between 2/3 to 90% of the U.S. population would perish. That's up to 288 million U.S. citizens, all because the electrical grid would fail. No power? Gas can't be pumped and oil can't be refined. You can't drive your car. No power? Trains wouldn't run and planes won't fly because their computer control systems require electricity. So the nation comes to an absolute standstill. Unless you have a bike or a horse, you aren't going anywhere. That means food can't be shipped from the breadbasket of the Midwest, where most of our grain is grown, or from California, where much of the nation's produce is grown. Without electricity, manufacturing shuts down, including all production of life-saving medications, like insulin. And with almost 7 out of 10 Americans on prescription drugs, what will happen when they can't get those meds? Banks will fail because all electronic records will be destroyed, or at the very least, inaccessible. Your credit cards and debit cards will be no good, and cash will only last so long, if anyone is accepting it. Your greenbacks could be as worthless as Monopoly money. Oh sure, there are backup gas generators, but once that initial fuel supply is exhausted, how will we get more? We need power to extract and refine fuel. The reality is, if the grid goes down in a nationwide EMP attack, it will stay down for months, or more likely, years. The fix is not an easy one, and that's because the backbone of our power grid is the thousands of large power transformers, or LPTs, spread across the country. Large power transformers are crucial components of the power grid. According to the Department of Energy, they number in the tens of thousands, and they're all critical to the daily flow of energy across the continental U.S. Each LPT costs several $1 million. They're made to order, and each one is customized for the individual power company that ordered it. That means they can't be made quickly, and they can't be made in large quantities at one time. In fact, most are made overseas, and they take up to 2 years to build. Most utility companies answer to their shareholders, so they don't keep millions of dollars in spare LPTs sitting around just in case. It just wouldn't be profitable. Each LPT weighs about 250 tons. You can see why transporting them is a logistical nightmare. They're so heavy that standard railway tracks can't handle the load. LPTs require specially built railway lines. The only problem is, many of those special railway lines have fallen into disrepair or have disappeared as land is sold off and developed. LPTs are often 30 to 40 years old, and executives who make purchasing decisions come and go, so nobody thinks about maintaining the infrastructure needed to transport them. Sometimes they can be shipped by regular roads, but that's just as complicated. Moving an LPT from a shipping port to its destination inland requires road, overpass, and bridge inspections along the entire route to ensure the infrastructure can handle the 250-ton load. Oftentimes it can't. Every mile of the journey requires a permit. Navigating the local, state, and federal permit system is another colossal headache. It takes months to get the required permissions. Let's say an EMP attack wiped out only a few dozen LPTs. That's an improbably rosy scenario, but bear with me. Let's say there were some backup LPTs in a government warehouse somewhere. Again, unlikely, but let's say so for the sake of argument. You couldn't get your LPT replacement very fast. You'd have to transport it from point A to point B, and we've seen what a hairy mess that is. And even if you got it there in a reasonably timely manner, it still probably wouldn't fit your local system. Remember, each one is customized. Further modifications would have to be made, under blackout conditions with limited resources. The LPT problem is very real. In 2014, the Department of Energy issued a report that candidly admitted it. The failure of a single unit could result in temporary service interruption and considerable revenue loss, as well as incur replacement and other collateral costs, said the report. Should several of these units fail at the same time, it will be challenging to replace. Now imagine an EMP attack. It has the potential to take out not just one or two, not just a few or a dozen, but thousands of LPTs in a split second. But FEMA's got this, doesn't it? Or the Department of Homeland Security, right? Wrong. Ever since the first commissioned EMP report was released to Congress in 2004, the government has been passing the buck. The right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. When questioned about power outages in case of extensive grid crashes, Jay Johnson, the current Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, replied, "Oh, I'm sure FEMA has the capability to bring in backup transformers. We've already seen how unrealistic that is, and besides, ask FEMA. They don't know a thing about it." Michael Chertoff was Secretary of Homeland Security under both Presidents Bush and Obama. I mentioned his recommendation a moment ago. He thinks a hand crank radio will get you through. Right, like that'll put food on your table and get you your life-saving meds. Janet Napolitano, another former Secretary of Homeland Security, at least has a clear view of how truly unprepared our government is. She is on record as saying there is no plan in place to deal with an extended grid outage situation. None. Zero. Zip. Nada. We aren't even close to being ready, folks. FEMA, the National Guard, and other organizations have trained for natural disasters, but an EMP attack would be far, far worse. In fact, such an attack would make the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina look like a Sunday picnic. Natural disasters are geographically limited. An EMP attack on the continental U.S. would be many times worse. FEMA, the National Guard, the military, the Department of Homeland Security, state entities, and first responders. None of them have trained for extended grid outages. In fact, here's what Craig Fugate, the administrator of FEMA, told Ted Koppel in an interview. We're not a country that can go without power for a long period of time without loss of life. Our systems, from water treatment to hospitals to traffic control to all these things that we expect every day, our ability to operate without electricity is minimal. And what does Fugate think we'd do? As he told Koppel, we'd be trying to hang on and keep as many people as possible from dying until the system comes back. There's good news and bad news. First, the good news. It would only take about a $2 billion investment to harden the grid against an EMP attack. That's small change compared to the high cost of doing nothing. The bad news? Your senators and representatives have dithered around in Congress for years, passing the buck. In 2010, the Grid Act was passed by the House, but stalled in the Senate. In 2013, the SHIELD Act was also introduced in the House, but got no further. Since 2014, various versions of the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act have been floating around in both houses of Congress. As of this writing, no vote has ever been scheduled. It doesn't seem as if Congress is very interested in protecting us against an EMP attack. In fact, in 2015, the government stopped pretending it had everything under control. In a series of actions, they candidly admitted they can't do it alone, and they've openly asked for help from the private sector. If there was ever a time to act on this information, it's now. And that's why we created an important new DVD, EMP Ready. There are plenty of great resources out there that address emergency preparedness. And by all means, you should look into them. Preparedness is always a good idea. But unless you take the EMP threat into consideration as you make your preparations, all your efforts could be in vain, and your family put in jeopardy. No other threat has the potential to wipe out all electrical power and all communication networks across an entire nation. Only an EMP could do that. George Cotter is the former chief scientist at the National Security Agency. He is an expert on grid security and vulnerabilities. If the grid were to go down, he said in April of 2015, it would be devastating. When such an attack occurs, he wrote, make no mistake, there will be major loss of life and serious crippling of national security capabilities. Cotter brings up an important point. A grid attack could be just the first wave in a series of attacks, and without electricity to support our national defense, well, we're toast. No radar to detect incoming aircraft or missiles. No communications to coordinate troops, and no transportation to move them around. No computer systems to run defensive weaponry. And then there's the civilian world, with no way to ship food around the country. No water treatment plants would mean no safe, clean drinking water for most of the population. Our health care would resemble Civil War medicine. Once personal supplies of medications run out, there will be no more for months or even years. But there is a glimmer of hope. What if a group of forward-thinking, proactive citizens were ready? Not just with a supply of clean water, food, and surplus medication, which everyone should have, by the way, but with a way to generate their own energy, with systems in place to protect communications. With energy and communication, two of the most critical systems, we could bootstrap our way back to the 21st century in a fraction of the time. One of the nation's leading experts on EMP, Chuck Manto, has been working on this problem for years. Chuck's resume is pretty darned impressive. He's an inventor with 6 patents, including patents for EMP protection. He's the CEO of a consulting and R&D firm that helps businesses protect their assets against an EMP attack. But perhaps Chuck's most praiseworthy effort is how he has brought together individuals and government to protect national critical infrastructure. Chuck is the founder and leader of the EMP focus group, InfraGard. InfraGard is a public-private partnership between professionals and the FBI, and its mission is to protect national critical infrastructure. But, as Herculean as that effort is, it's not enough. And Chuck will be the first to admit it. The solution to the EMP threat can't be left solely in the hands of government or business. There's too much to do, and we've seen that it's not getting done. In fact, here's what Chuck had to say when asked if government, utilities, and businesses are doing anything to protect us. It's so bad right now, and we are so vulnerable, that unless a power company or communications firm can explicitly tell you that we have met and exceeded an objective standard for EMP protection, you might as well assume that they are totally vulnerable and very fragile. That's why you have to be a part of the solution too. In Chuck's own words, we can't depend on others. We're going to have to rethink our whole level of preparedness at the individual level and at the local community level to be able to cope with something like that, he says. I know it can seem overwhelming, but take a deep breath. It's totally doable. Recently, we were privileged to have Chuck sit down with us and tell us everything he knows about EMP, what it is the risk of an EMP attack, and what the solutions are. In EMP Ready, Chuck lays out the practical steps you can take to prepare for and protect against the effects of an EMP attack in the areas of power generation and communications, the two most critical pieces of our infrastructure. If every household were able to self-generate even 10% of what they get from the power company today, it would be significant. It would be life-saving. If every household had working communications devices and a communications plan, it would be a game changer. EMP is a man-made phenomenon, and it's scary enough by itself. But that's not all we have to worry about. EMP has a close cousin that is an entirely natural event. It's called a CME, which stands for coronal mass ejection. It's an extreme form of space weather. In this DVD, you'll learn about CMEs as well, how a CME differs from an EMP attack, and how it could be almost as devastating. In EMP Ready, you'll also discover simple steps you can take at home to reduce the chances of your equipment getting fried in an EMP attack. The best communication system for a nationwide blackout. You'll be relieved to know there's already a trained network of people in place, and you can join them if you like. 2 places to find scarce EMP-resistant communications equipment for you and your family. How EMP works. Don't worry, we make the science really easy to understand. What is the likelihood of an EMP attack? How long government officials have known about EMP, and the relatively low-cost solution that would neutralize the threat. Why you can't depend on your elected representatives to put this inexpensive solution into effect. The damage that's been done by CME space weather events, and what we've learned from them. The best communication equipment you can own for a nationwide blackout. How to protect new communications equipment from EMP if you can't find the right EMP-resistant gear. How to build your own EMP-resistant shielding for vulnerable electrical and electronic gear. A step-by-step how-to demonstration for gear protection using items you can buy at your local hardware store. How to power your communications gear if the grid does go down. What you need to know about home power generation, and how to protect it from an EMP attack. Critical resources for learning more about EMP and how you can better prepare for an attack. It used to be that if you even mentioned EMP, they gave you a tinfoil hat to wear. Now the subject makes headline news and has been the subject of television documentaries and best-selling books. Does it take time and a little money to prepare for an EMP attack? Yes, but what's the alternative? If you're thinking, why should I bother? The experts will solve this problem. Remember this. Congress has failed to require utilities to put relatively inexpensive protection in place. Utility companies answer to their shareholders, not to you, and they're unwilling to invest profits in system backups that may or may not be needed. But CENTCOM Commander General Lloyd Austin thinks the utility companies need to be ready. Remember, he said it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. But here's the thing. Even if you think General Austin is full of hot air, don't make the mistake of confusing the concept of risk with the concept of stakes. Even if the risk is low, and I don't believe it is, not for a second, the stakes are high. Your livelihood is at stake. Your health is at stake. Your access to clean water, food, and medical care is at stake. Your entire way of life is at stake. In fact, your very life and the lives of your loved ones are at stake. Remember, the EMP Commission told Congress, within 12 months of an EMP attack or solar flare, between 2/3 to 90% of the U.S. population would perish. You're essentially betting your life against a tiny investment of time and effort. Our culture values convenience over resilience. If you're still reading this, chances are you're countercultural. How does an EMP attack work? So now is the time for action. EMP Ready gets you up to speed on the threat, how it might unfold, and the simple things you can do to be ready for it. How much warning will we have for a CME event? Would an EMP attack likely be part of a large-scale invasion? You probably have many questions. In EMP Ready, we set out to address the most pressing of these. Questions like, how much of our own power do we need to be able to generate for long-term survival? How are solar generators a mission-critical component? How can you shield a solar generator from the effects of EMP? What communication systems can we expect to work in an EMP CME scenario? Will landlines, cell phones, and the internet work? Can we rely on Faraday cages to protect our equipment? You could scour the web for hours, or buy a dozen or more books, and you'd only find a fraction of the information presented in EMP Ready. What you won't find anywhere else is the in-depth analysis by one of the leading EMP experts. What will EMP Ready cost you? Perhaps the real question is, what will it cost you if you aren't ready for an EMP attack? And I think you know the answer to that. All I'm asking you to sacrifice is one dinner out at a nice restaurant. That's it. And that depends on your definition of nice restaurant. It could be less. For just $49.95, you'll get EMP Ready with over 1 hour and 45 minutes packed with the information you need to know to protect yourself and your loved ones. In fact, if you consulted with our EMP expert Chuck Manto yourself, you'd pay hundreds of dollars per hour just to sit down and ask him a few questions. We did it for you, and you get it for just $49.95. So what are you waiting for? Scroll down below and click the Add to Cart button. We'll rush EMP Ready to you so that you can be ready no matter what happens. I'll just share one closing thought with you. One thing Chuck said when we interviewed him for this DVD, and you'll hear his words yourself in EMP Ready, is that if the U.S. were attacked with an EMP weapon, our very sovereignty could be at stake. Our freedom, our heritage, it could all vanish in an instant. But not if we're ready. If we're ready and vigilant, no foreign powers can steal our country from us. During World War II, the Japanese made plans to attack the U.S. mainland. Then they realized that American citizens were ready to defend themselves and their country with their own firearms. Now as then, our destiny may well be decided, not by what our government does, but by what we as individuals do. I urge you to get your copy of EMP Ready right now. Don't delay another minute. Click the button below to order.